You have a spending problem, plain and simple. Right now, households across the country are drowning in debt. The numbers are staggering. Nearly $18 trillion in total household debt. That's credit cards, car loans, student loans, mortgages, you name it.
Mortgages, car loans, credit cards. Americans are borrowing more than ever.
Credit card balances alone have just hit a record $1.16 trillion. And let's not forget car loans at $1.64 trillion. We're borrowing like there's no tomorrow. But let's be honest, this is not just because people are reckless with their money. It's a symptom of something much bigger. Rising living costs, stagnant wages, and an economy that thrives on pushing easy credit have created the perfect storm. Borrow, spend, repeat. It's not just a habit, it's the system you live in. While you struggle to make your payments, pay off minimum balances, and wonder how to make ends meet, your government is no better. In fact, it's worse. Much worse.
And it's not just families taking on more debt, but also the U.S. government.
If you think $18 trillion in household debt sounds bad, take a deep breath, because your national debt is growing by billions every single day. Just like you, your government spends more than it earns.
Clearly, the government is borrowing beyond its means, and it continues to borrow.
It borrows to cover shortfalls, racks up interest, and pushes payments further down the road. Today's date, as of writing this script, is December 2nd, 2024. Your government has already spent $1.25 trillion towards 2025. Just like you, of course, not all of you, but some of you, have already spent thousands of dollars towards 2025, even though 2025 is not here yet. For the last 20 years, every single year, your government has spent more money than it actually makes. In 2001 was the last time your government spent less than it made. Since then, it has never been better. In 2024, it generated $4.9 trillion, but spent $6.7 trillion. That's $2 trillion more in debt. This is what I mean by you have a spending problem, and so does your government. When you overspend, you face late fees and credit dings. When the government overspends, it reshapes the economy, and not always for the better.
America's rising debt is pushing up interest rates around the world.
Just like you wouldn't want to max out a credit card forever, the government doesn't want to keep printing money to cover its spending. But sometimes it does, and you end up paying the bill. So, who's really to blame here? Is it you, living beyond your means? Or is it the system, the policies and practices that have normalized debt at every level, from personal to federal? Or perhaps it's a combination of both. To truly understand this massive problem in our DNA, we need to take a closer look at the entire picture, from how money is earned to where it's spent, wasted, and even lavishly overspent.
U.S. household debt now at $17.94 trillion.
$35 trillion, which is the total national debt today.
I was in about $60,000 worth of debt.
The national debt increased by nearly 90%.
Credit card debt surpassed $1 trillion. That's a 16% growth.
Every 100 days, the U.S. has added $1 trillion to its debt.
Let's find out. Right now, your national debt is sitting at $36 trillion. For some perspective, that's $106,000 of debt for every single American, man, woman, and child. The good news is, most of this debt is owned by the government itself, so you are good for now. The problem is, the situation is expected to get worse over the next decade, not better. But how does a country even get into $36 trillion of debt? How did we even get here?
The government owes close to $35 trillion. This is bigger than the U.S. economy.
Well, it's surprisingly similar to how you rack up personal debt. Just like you, the government has income and expenses. Its income comes from taxes, things like income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax. But when the government wants to spend more money than it earns, it borrows. For example, when the government needs cash, it sells bonds. A bond is like an IOU. Investors, both individuals and countries like China and Japan, loan their money to the government by buying these bonds. In return, the government promises to pay them back later with interest. So, when you hear that the US owes trillions of dollars, it's because they've sold bonds to cover their spending. But there's a catch. Just like a homeowner who can't make their mortgage payments, the government could technically default on its debt if it can't pay its bondholders. And since countries like China, Japan, and the UK hold a massive portion of these bonds, a default wouldn't just hurt you, it would send shockwaves across the entire global economy. Apart from issuing bonds, There is also one more way to cope with this. When the government runs out of money, the US Federal Reserve, the country's central bank, can step in and create new money just by turning on the printing machine. This freshly minted cash is used to buy government bonds, injecting money into the economy. But they can't just recklessly print more and more money. Why? Because printing money devalues the currency over time and drives up inflation, which hits your wallet. By now, you're probably starting to see the problem. Just like you, your government has a spending problem too, and fixing it is not as simple as cutting costs or raising taxes. Why? Because neither option is particularly popular. Imagine the government coming to you and saying, hey, we need more money, so we are raising your taxes. Not exactly something you want to hear, right? On the flip side, imagine budget cuts to programs like Social Security, healthcare, schools, or even defense spending. Also a hard pill to swallow. But ignoring the problem won't make it go away. In fact, it's only getting worse. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the annual deficit is expected to grow from $2 trillion this year to $2.8 trillion by 2034. As this deficit balloons, so does the national debt, pushing it to new highs we've never seen before. Right now, the debt to GDP ratio stands at 99%. That's already a lot. But by 2034, it's projected to hit 122%, surpassing the previous record set during World War II. This is the equivalent of running a business where your debt is bigger than everything your company produces in a year.
America's GDP is around $28 trillion and their debt is $35 trillion.
And then there's a new challenge making things worse: higher interest rates. As we discussed before, when the government borrows money, it does so by selling bonds. These bonds come with a promise: we'll pay you back later, plus interest. And these interest rates are no longer low. Thanks to inflation, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates from nearly 0% to over 5.5%. That means every time your government borrows money now, it's at a much higher cost than before. And here's why that's a big deal. When old debt comes due, your government doesn't pay it off like you might pay off a credit card. Instead, it rolls the debt over, essentially borrowing more money to pay off the old loans. But with higher interest rates, the cost of that new borrowing is skyrocketing. This year alone, your government will pay $870 billion in interest payments on its debt.
$870 billion is the interest.
Think about that. $870 billion just to cover interest. To put that into perspective, that's more than the combined GDP of Hong Kong, Qatar, and Portugal. Yes, your government is spending more on interest payments than these three nations produce in an entire year. And it's only going to get worse. By 2034, interest payments are expected to reach 4% of the entire US economy, taking up 1/6 of all federal spending. This means less money for everything else: infrastructure, education, healthcare, and more. This is what economists call a debt spiral. Higher interest rates mean higher interest payments, which means your government has to borrow even more to cover the costs. But borrowing more money adds to the total debt, which in turn increases future interest payments. It's a vicious cycle, and without intervention, it risks spiraling out of control. To put this into perspective, every 100 days, the US adds another $1 trillion to its debt. That's $1 trillion every 3 months.
Every 3 months, America's debt has increased by $1 trillion.
But here's the question: what is all that money actually being spent on? Just like you with too many bills, your government also has a lot of expenses, running state departments, social welfare programs, infrastructure, and more. But there is one area where spending feels more like throwing money blindly: the Defense Department. In fact, 13% of the federal budget allocated to running the government goes to the defense, particularly the military. You often hear lawmakers advocating for increased defense spending.
We need, in the United States, to spend more on defense. It's a necessity.
Let's look at some of these numbers together. In 2022, your government spent $877 billion on its defense. To put that into perspective, your government spends more than these 10 countries combined. Think about that for a second. One country outspending the combined defense budgets of 10 others. The Pentagon, the department responsible for this massive chunk of taxpayer money, has not been able to account for how it's being spent. That's right, for 6 years in a row, the Pentagon has failed to pass an independent audit. Accountants have tried to track their spending, only to find that 63% of physical assets, nearly $4 trillion in assets, are all missing. What does that mean? It means the Pentagon doesn't know where a lot of its stuff is, which also means they're likely spending taxpayer money on things they already own but can't find. Imagine if you kept buying the same phone charger because you couldn't remember where you left the last one. Now scale that up to $800 billion budget. And here's another head scratcher. The US pulled out of Afghanistan a few years ago, and the war in Iraq is over. You'd think that defense spending would decrease? It did, for about a split second, but now it's climbing again. Why? That's where private contractors came into the picture. A huge chunk of defense money, more than 50% of the defense budget, goes to private defense contractors. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. More than half of the defense budget, specifically the military budget, flows to private corporations. And if you look at the data, the same 5 names dominate year after year. General Dynamics, Boeing, Grumman, Raytheon, and Martin. These companies are the heavyweights of the defense industry, and over the past few decades, they've consolidated their power by buying out smaller competitors. Back in the 1990s, there were 51 major defense contractors. Today, there are only 5. This creates what's known as a monopoly, or in this case, an oligopoly. These 5 companies hold such control over the industry that the government has no choice but to buy from them. The problem with that kind of monopoly power is that when there's no competition, prices can skyrocket. Take the Stinger missile, for example. In 1991, the Pentagon paid $25,000 for one missile. Today, they're paying more than $400,000 for the same missile. That's a huge increase, even accounting for inflation. Even the most basic items are drastically overpriced. Take something as simple as a ball bearing. You can buy one for $20, but when the US government buys that same item from Boeing, they're paying a staggering $3,000 or more just for one piece. This is not just a single example either. Across the board, routine items like spare parts and basic components are being sold at prices that would make your jaw drop. It's not just inflation driving these costs. It's a system where defense contractors can charge almost whatever they want, knowing the government has little choice but to pay. This kind of overpricing funnels billions of taxpayer dollars into private corporations for things that shouldn't cost a fraction of what's being paid. And all of it adds up, contributing to a ballooning national debt while delivering massive profits to these companies. Now, most of you might be wondering, if the government is aware of this, why is not doing anything about these corporations? Well, these corporations keep most of the politicians in their pockets. They invest heavily in influencing lawmakers. Take Lockheed Martin, for example. In this election cycle, they've spent $2.7 million lobbying both Democrats and Republicans. And this isn't just about campaign donations. It involves trips, events, and showcasing their weapons to ensure lawmakers see things their way. In 2022 alone, top defense companies hired 672 people directly from the Pentagon to work as lobbyists, executives, and board members. This lobbying pays off big time. Congress keeps approving massive defense budgets, ensuring billions continue flowing to these companies. The real issue is not just with lawmakers, it's with the system, a system that allows defense contractors to wield so much influence over politicians. This system creates a cycle where more military spending leads to more lobbying, more campaign contributions, and even more military spending. And it's all funded by the money Uncle Sam collected from you last Friday. At a time when the national debt is spiraling out of control and vital programs like education and healthcare are underfunded, we need to ask ourselves, is this really the best use of our resources? Because every dollar wasted on overpriced contracts, unnecessary projects, and lobbying is a dollar that could have been spent on solving real problems, building a better future for all of us. By now, you see the pattern. You have a spending problem, and so does your government. The question is not just, why are we spending so much? It's also, where does that money go? And most importantly, who benefits from this spending? The good news is, there is a solution to all this massive spending. As of today's date, December 7th, 2024, the only viable solution is that there is no solution, because God has already blessed the credit card, and God has massively blessed Jay Powell's printing machine.
Credit card debt has surpassed $1 trillion.
National defense is the single largest category of the discretionary part of federal spending.
U.S. fiscal deficit is projected to stay elevated.
The IMF is telling the U.S. that it cannot keep borrowing without limits.
Data show more Americans are taking on debt.
I'm in the process of working with a client who has opened up 8 accounts, and this is in a matter of 2 months.